Who the hell is Discovery Optics? Well, they're a Chinese OEM that makes their own scopes and sells them to markets that don't have access to scopes that we do here in the lovely US of A. A few years ago, they sent me their Gen 1 3-15 and 5-25 for review, and all things considered, I think that they were fairly decent scopes for the price for markets that have no other access to other scopes like, again, what we have. That is something to keep in mind. This is just an evolution of their 5-25, obviously in the form of a Gen 2. They actually took a lot of what I had to say and criticize with their Gen 1 and implement it here in this Gen 2 form. And they managed to do that in a quite small amount of time. I'm genuinely curious to see if this Gen 2 is going to be a true improvement over the Gen 1. And Discovery Optics, if you are watching this video, which you more than likely are because, well, you guys know about me and you sent this in for me to review, thank you very much for doing so. Full transparency, folks, they sent this in for me so I can review it, and they're going to take whatever I say as far as criticisms, pros and cons of this thing, and they're going to implement that probably in a Gen 3 variant down the line. With all that being said though, let's take a closer look on the inside and see if there's 3 sunshades that equal to like 35 inches.
For anyone that watched the Gen 1 review, you'll remember that the box on that thing was gigantic. Discovery Optics smartly decided to make the box normal sized. And by normal sized, just the right amount of room required to fit the scope and all of the components that come inside of it. That is the only information on the outside of the box, and no, I didn't even bother setting the focus on that. Opening up the box and you will see that everything is very nicely laid out. You have the scope, a single sunshade, and all of the other accessories that came with the Gen 1. That includes 2 scope caps, front and rear. The last one only had the front and not the rear. A single sunshade that is, I think, 3 inches long. A little cleaning brush. A leveling tool, which is pretty nice. I've reviewed something similar to that in the past, and it does work pretty good. An Allen key and a set of rings. Now, I have reviewed Discovery Optics Precision 7075 rings. I think they're actually really quite nice, all things considered. However, these rings don't really fill me with joy or confidence. What I mean by that is when we look inside the box, they just don't exude any sort of quality. And it's partly to be expected. This normally is around a $350 package, which is pretty damn good. And right now, Amazon has it, at least on October 19th of 2024, for around $300. And that's not a lot of money for what this scope is apparently offering. As you could see, the finish on it isn't really great, and it just looks really crummy. And for people that don't understand the importance of a good ring, imagine building a house on a bad foundation or trying to drive a car with flat bowl tires. It's just not going to be a good time. Don't cheap out on rings if you can avoid it, people, please. As far as the weight on this thing, it is still quite heavy, just over 44 ounces on my scale. That is nearly 8 ounces heavier than the next heaviest scope that we're going to put this thing up against in a few minutes. But first, let's finish going over this thing physically. The first one wasn't what I'd consider a very handsome optic. It had a lot going on, and none of it seemed really uniform or well thought out. However, that is not the case with the Gen 2. A lot of these controls feature the exact same sort of knurling on everything, and I'm a huge fan of knurling, especially when it's done right. It should be nice, sharp, and coarse. It shouldn't be super fine where if it gets packed with a little bit of dirt or if your hand's a little wet, you're going to slip off of it. This is very aggressive texturing and it feels really solid in hand. It's something that I really do like. Anywho, fast focus eyepiece all the way up and half a turn or so in. And believe it or not, this thing is absolutely rock solid. Impressively so. A lot of scopes that I've been reviewing lately, especially the more modern stuff, they've really fixed a lot of the slop in their fast focus eyepieces. And even they've even increased the tension on the seals inside, it feels like, because a lot of them are hard to turn, which is exactly what you want in an eyepiece that once you set it to your eye, you should never have to make an adjustment again. Moving on to the magnification ring, we have 5 at 12 o'clock and 25 just past 6 o'clock, so a little bit over 180 degrees of throw, and it's in the correct orientation. What I mean by that is the cattail is away from where it would be leaning up against my body as a right-handed shooter if the gun was in front of me. As far as the actual throw on this, it actually feels, again, quite good. The knurling is very nice, and that cattail is a nice little feature to have. I think every optic nowadays should have at least a threaded hole for a cattail to be installed. You don't have to necessarily have a giant thumb ramp or something like what the loopholed Mark IIIs or Mark IVs or Mark Vs even do. But even something like this with those little tiny threads seems to do the job pretty well. I would still like to see it be twice as large diameter for the threads, because it really does make me feel like if it just falls ever so perfectly on something, it's just going to shear right off. But nevertheless, I'm at least happy that it's there, but it can absolutely be improved. Moving on to the illumination control. There is a very large knob for it, and inside you can see we have a very standard 3-dimple board and 6-prong spring on the top. This is the standard battery compartment for almost everything under $1,000 nowadays. I haven't had any issues with them, and I reckon you probably won't either. One thing that I do still appreciate is the knurling on the outside. It's very consistent with everything else, but the battery cap itself is still really large. It's a little bit smaller than the knob, so if you get a good purchase on the knob and turn it, you're not really going to be grabbing the actual cap all that much, but still it should be smaller or smoother and have a coin slot in it. That's the only real way to alleviate that. As you can see, if you don't grab deep enough on the dial, you will absolutely take that cap off. As far as how the knob actually feels, it's pretty good. It's not great. It's kind of hard to turn, and the detents aren't very deep, so it just seems like it's just skipping over everything, and it doesn't really fill you full of confidence. The parallax knob, again, has the exact same knurling, goes from 25 yards to infinity, and it's about a 270-degree throw. It's made even more challenging by just how large the side parallax knob is, but thankfully it's as big as it is because it is so ridiculously hard to turn that if it was any smaller, it would probably rip flesh off of my skin if it tried to slip off of the knurling. It's how aggressive the knurling is, and that's how hard it is to turn the side parallax. With my uses of this, which were, albeit not, I'm going to throw this off a building, it didn't really seem to loosen up all that much, but I'm sure with, a couple of hundred turns of it, it'll probably start to loosen up eventually. The turrets are another vast improvement. They are non-locking, as you can very clearly tell, but they do feature a pretty stout looking zero stop. The windage is again non-locking, doesn't have a zero stop because it can't have a zero stop, but at least it's labeled in the correct fashion. And I like that they chose 10 mils per rotation because it's so easy just to go one full turn and go, oh, I'm at 10 now, and then 20, and so on and so forth. Sometimes a lot of companies will do 12 mils per rotation, and it's like, I'm at 12 or am I at 13? I have no idea where I am. It's something that's just, it's easier to work with when it's in increments of 10, especially dealing with mils, because just keep it simple, stupid. As far as how the turrets sound and feel, well, I'm going to show you that very close very soon, but let's take a real quick look at the zero stop. I make fun of Athlon scopes for having the very small screw that holds the cap onto their turrets. DiscoveryOpt decided, we're going to go with a giant stainless steel screw. And you know what? I really do appreciate that because it makes me feel confident when I screw it in, it's not going to just break off by, accidentally looking at it funny. As far as the zero stop, there you go. A couple of set screws, you spin it down, you lock it down, you spin it around, and you are good to go. It does look very robust and solid, and a very nice welcome touch. So far, I'm very impressed by this Gen 2. I love what they did with all of their touch points. All the controls are pretty damn nice, despite the fact some of them could still use some work, but it looks like it's a cohesive package. Anyway, let's see if it could perform anywhere near as good as it looks. Finally getting behind this scope, and you could already take away a couple of things. First off, the reticle looks fantastic at 5x. You can see the cattail over there at 3 o'clock and that giant elevation turret over at 12 o'clock. If you are planning on running an offset red dot on this thing at the 12 o'clock position, be prepared to have a mount that is gigantic in order to clear that giant turret. Slowly increasing the magnification to maximum, you can see that it does look like it softens up a little bit as far as the reticle goes, but we didn't have any eyebox shift or exit pupil shift or darkening to the image, nothing like that. Reticle does get a little bit on the softer side, but illumination looks good. So is that the end of the world already? No, because there are a lot of other scopes that do the same exact thing for a lot more money. As long as the center is really sharp and the outside is still capable of seeing stuff downrange, I'll be happy with it. The one area with the Gen 1 that I probably criticized the most with it was its overall image stability. At 25x, you could see already that the reticle does this smearing effect, and we're going to find out real soon if that's as visible as you think it might be in real-world environments. This was, of course, without the zero stop set, but I have to say, these turrets sound and feel fantastic, even if they don't line up 100%. Right off the bat, however, with the tracking test segment, you can see that even though our zero is pretty solid, the reticle doesn't seem to line up very well with my target. I know this target to be pretty good because I've reviewed some very good scopes on this thing, and it's when the scope is good, you know it's good because everything is absolutely perfect. Here, it's at least 0.2 of a mil off between its 0 and plus 10 mils of added elevation using the reticle for holdovers, favoring heavy. So it's 102% positive. We will see how well that tracks momentarily, but as I dial back the magnification, you can see that the image loses a fair amount of sharpness without me adjusting the side parallax. So optically, there's definitely some issues going on. It's definitely not the most polished setup that I've ever tested, but let's see if it'll at least track appropriately to either its reticle or the target itself, and then just see how well it actually performs in most other environments. Testing the elevation and windage for slop, and I am happy to report that at least there's none to be found in this test. For the rest of this, I'm going to speed it up because you don't need to listen to me talk for another 25 minutes about its tracking performance. As far as the windage tracking, it is absolutely perfect for 4 mils, more or less. Bringing the windage back to 0, you can see we're favoring the right-hand side of that line because I did not clock the scope 100% perfectly. And as we get to the 10 mil mark, we do find that the turrets track properly to the reticle. So at least that is consistent. It also returns to 0 and then back to plus 10 mils, perfectly fine a few times. So as bad as it is, it could be worse. Outside in the bright, beautiful spring light, focusing on an 81-yard paper target at a tree. That's exactly what we've got going on right now. Not a whole lot. Beautiful weather conditions. I miss the spring. It's late fall, and I love the fall, but the spring is just so full of life and hope and excitement. And the fall brings the winter and all the snow and cold. Illumination on full is actually quite visible, all things considered, and increasing the magnification rapidly to 25x. And you know what? It doesn't look half bad. I did set the side parallax to roughly where I thought it was going to have to be at 81 yards, and it was, in fact, pretty damn close. The image here at 25x is not bad. Not bad at all. And neither is the illumination. And neither is the reticle. The reticle reminds me a lot of some of the precision Zeiss reticles, which is something that I do admire and actually quite like. Earlier when we were looking at the reticle, I did a quick image stability test and the reticle smeared. Here, It does not do that at 25x, nor at 20x. Only when you get to the real far extremes of looking through the image does it do it, yes. But inside the area that you could actually still see through the scope, it's actually pretty stable and pretty clear. It's not half bad, if I may say so myself. Bringing the magnification down to 15x, and the view through it is still quite nice, but the exit pupil does seem a little bit on the narrower side. However, on paper, it's actually quite large, both at minimum and maximum. But I have to say, the image stability on this is vastly improved over the Gen 1. And at 5x, you can see that we have a much larger view looking through it. How does this translate to a more dynamic roll? Well, let me show you. Starting in the reverse order, we're going to start at 5x and work our way up to 25x. Illumination is on full at the exact same target, albeit about 5 yards closer. 5x is quite nice. The reticle is very easy to pick up, as is the illumination. You can see we have a fair amount of wiggle room behind it, and it really isn't that challenging to work with. At 10x, we also have a pretty good looking performance. And I love the fact that you can see the illumination even when you start getting deep into the shadows. Not many first focal plane scopes do this. And I wish more would, because it really helps draw my eye to getting back behind it on center, especially if you're in a really awkward position. At 20x, you could see the smearing that we saw earlier, but again, it's when you're way off past the actual view through this thing, so it's not as bad as it could be, whereas the Gen 1, you looked at it a little off and it was completely miserable looking. 25x, however, when you're right on the center and you go a little bit left and right, there is a little bit of wiggle room, but pretty far off perfect center, and you are going to have a smeary looking reticle. However, with a decent cheek weld though, it shouldn't be much of an issue. However, you will absolutely notice this every time you get behind it. Given the fact that this thing has ED glass, a 56mm front objective, a 34mm tube, and honestly a very large view looking through it, one would hope that it has decent low light performance. Ambient light there doesn't look half bad. We have a fair amount of information downrange, and coming at behind it at 5x, it does seem a little bit on the darker side. The illumination's good even in fairly bright environments, so here in clearly very low light environments, it is very, very nice. You actually don't even have to be at maximum brightness to use it even remotely effectively. Slowly increasing the magnification, it looks really good until we hit about 20x. From 20 to 25x, it gets dramatically darker very quickly. And it's kind of shocking because the exit pupil on this thing at 25x is 2.2 millimeters, or at least so DiscoveryOpt claims. To put that in retrospect, it's the exact same size that Vortex claims the Venom is at 25x, 2.2 mil. At about 16x is when the image really starts to lighten up and be much more usable. But above that, it really becomes very challenging. And as you saw, shifting the camera side to side yielded a very poor result for image stability. Not a great performance. Let's push this thing well beyond its probable most common used distances. We are starting at 5x with the side parallax dialed into roughly 500 yards on this first solar panel. And I might as well talk about the one thing I haven't really talked about. The view through this thing is not only very large, but the amount of scope body we see is very small. The Gen 1s did this too, but the Gen 1s had a lot more distortion to the image. The image on this actually feels very flat, no matter what magnification you're at. It is a vast improvement over the Gen 1s. But is it better than a lot of the other competition for around this price point? That is something we are going to find out quite soon. But at this distance, at 25x, the side parallax seemed to line up absolutely perfect. The image is actually quite good. It's not on par with a lot of the higher end optics, clearly, but it is capable of producing a decent image without much real chromatic aberration to my eye. It's actually more impressive than I thought it would be. Backing down the magnification to 10x, we're going to focus on our roughly 700-ish yard target, and then our 1,000, and then well out to our 2,000-ish. At this distance, I don't know what it was, but you could see that the image does get a little bit darker. At 25x, I do have to tweak the side parallax, but I did not tweak it to what this distance was supposed to be. Once we get that dialed in, it does look pretty good as well. Do I think a lot of people that buy this scope are going to be engaging at this distance? No, because I really do feel, and I kind of actually hope that this scope will stay more or less on rimfire builds for a couple of reasons, which we'll talk about soon. But just know that if you did want to stretch this thing out to several hundred yards, that it can produce a pretty good image, albeit one that is not dialed up for elevation. We will test that momentarily. But first, let's put this out to 1,000 yards and then 2,000 yards before finding out how well it's capable of keeping a decent image with 10 mils of elevation added on. Bringing it back down to 10x before increasing it to 25x here at about 1,000 yards on the solar panel, and you can see that summer mirage is really starting to creep up and distort the image. However, looking past the mirage, there's actually pretty decent information here. You can see a lot of what's going on downrange. A lot of those heavy-duty cables, they're pretty damn sharp and clear. Not to mention the depth of field out there at this distance is pretty wide, meaning that things in the foreground and things in the background, as opposed to where our main focal point is, are all pretty well sharp and clear. Bringing back the magnification to 10x before we dial up 10 mils of elevation and reacquire that solar panel at 25x. Bringing back our 0 and our focal point back to where we started, and right off the bat, there isn't a whole lot of degradation to the image. It is a little bit softer, but not a dramatic amount to the point where you can't really use it. I do tweak the side parallax, and it does seem to be a little bit better, but now we are basically pegged at infinity as opposed to being really close to 1,000 yards on the marker. All things considered, this really isn't that bad, and we didn't have a major shift to the exit pupil on this thing. It was pretty well established where our original, let's say, point of focus was. It's actually pretty damn good. Bringing it back to 0 mils and focusing well out into the horizon, roughly at 2,000 yards on those farthest power towers. And again, despite the massive amount of mirage coming off from the hot air, it's a pretty damn good looking image. This thing performed way better than I thought it would at this sort of distance, and I'm kind of shocked by it, to be brutally honest. We might as well check the image stability one more time while we're at 1,000 yards with picture perfect in environmentals. This is still with 10 mils of elevation added, and as you can see, it is quite tight. A lot tighter than I feel the numbers represent. However, at least the reticle and the target downrange remain stable, meaning they're at least sharp until you can't look through the scope anymore. That is a vast improvement over the Gen 1 and a better performance than a lot of other low-budget scopes in this sort of magnification range. Bringing it back to 0 mils, and we get the exact same size view looking through it. We have the exact same amount of wiggle room, but the image does sharpen up quite a bit. I feel this scope would be great if you're more or less holding for the reticle as opposed to dialing a massive amount of elevation, but you know, to each their own. At 20x, we get a slightly better performance as 25, no surprise there, and it does increase as slightly to each magnification going down to its minimum. At 10x, we have obviously a slightly larger performance than we did at 20, but it doesn't seem as big as it should be, and that's one of the kick in the nuts for me with this scope. It's just the numbers don't seem to tell the whole story, and that's one of the main reasons why I love doing these in-depth reviews, because it gives you a better sense of how these things are going to perform. Despite the fact that the view through it does seem a little bit on the tighter side, I am painfully impressed by how this thing looks stability-wise. Finally, into the side-by-side comparisons. On the left will be the DiscoveryOpt Gen 2, and we're going to start out with the DiscoveryOpt Gen 1 on the right. Like I had said earlier, the people that I spoke to at Discovery Optics really wanted to try to make a very inexpensive Razer Gen 2 HD style of optic for markets that cannot access things like Razer HD Gen 2s. A lot of parts of Southeast Asia and stuff like that, they can't get scopes that we can get. So it makes sense that a Chinese OEM would want to model a scope after something that's extremely popular and well received and try to make it for a fraction of the price for markets that can't get what we can get. So that is the absolute most important thing to take note here. Despite the fact that they sell the scope here, we might not be their intended market. It's all the other countries in the world that can't get what we can get. Despite that, though, they do sell it here because why not? They have the opportunity and the option to, so why wouldn't you want to extend yourself and your product to the rest of the world? Despite the varying weather conditions when I film both of these optics, the D1 clearly loses a lot of focus outside the center, whereas the DiscoveryOpt Gen 2 really holds on to that edge-to-edge sharpness very, very high by comparison. Another thing to take note with the Gen 1 is the view looking through it is gigantic, way larger than what the Gen 2 is, and the Gen 2 is already pretty large. So the Gen 1 was really, really big, and I think that's part of the reason why they had so many optical issues. The Gen 2, I feel, is much more stable, much sharper, much cleaner looking image, and much more overall consistent. And consistency is something that I think a lot of people don't think about. And that's something that I really try to focus on, because if you have a scope that performs consistently from its minimum to its maximum magnification and everywhere in between, to me, that's a much better scope than something that performs good at either end on the extreme and like it tapers off in the middle. A lot of scopes I've reviewed do that, and it really frustrates me because it makes me feel like it's a half-cocked product. This, on the other hand, at least the Gen 2, is a much better rendition of what they did with the Gen 1, and it just proves that a company, when told things in a certain light, in a certain way, can and will make course corrections on their product to improve them to make us all happy. I cannot vouch for Discovery Optics in any other way, shape, or form other than the minimal amount of communication that I've had with them, but they seem willing to at least listen to me and what my thoughts are on their products. And as you can very clearly tell, this Gen 2 is a massive step forward from the Gen 1 from an optics standpoint, and a control standpoint, and a build quality standpoint, and an overall thought process standpoint. Yeah, it's just a better scope overall. It's actually enjoyable to use. The Gen 1 had a lot of distortion, a lot of really bad image stability issues, and it was nauseating for me to use. It actually gave me a headache. It had fisheye at every magnification, whereas the Gen 2 is, again, a much flatter image, and it's actually quite pleasant to shoot at any magnification that I experienced. I shot this thing for a couple of weeks, and I still have it on my shelf. I pull it down every once in a while. I feel it. I look at out in my backyard with it. I'm like, you know what? This thing isn't terrible. Despite the fact that it's not terrible, it's still up against some very stiff competition. The Vortex Venom 5-25 by 56 is another first focal plane Chinese-made optic, albeit one that does not have illumination, but it has most of the other stuff. As far as numbers on paper, they're kind of sort of similar, but the Venom is much smaller and much lighter. It's an inch shorter at 15.3 inches as opposed to 16.3. It's 9 ounces or so lighter, which is massive. Its field of view, however, is a little bit smaller at 5x, 21 feet versus 24. But at 25x, they're claimed to be exactly the same. Exit pupil wise, again, guess what? They're exactly the same, 11.2 to 2.2. Eye relief, no, they're not exactly the same, but they're really close. 3.4 for the Discovery and 3.6 for the Vortex. So here are two Chinese optics with very similar specs on paper, very similar views looking through one another, and really similar amounts of scope body that we see. I wonder. I wonder. This is the stuff that I think about. Who's in bed with who? Who makes whose scopes? And it's like, yeah, it makes you wonder. The street price for the Venom is a little bit more expensive. They're around $500 every once in a while, but you can easily find them in the mid to high threes on sale, maybe even in the low to mid fours a little more consistently. But I have seen them go for as high as the low to mid 500s, which I think is a bit of a stretch. I still have my Venom. I do really like it. I had it on one of my 22 trainers for a while. And for a 22 trainer, both of these I feel are very capable options. I say 22 trainer because there's still an air and a sense and a feel of cheapness to both of them. Yes, you might be saying, but Vortex has an amazing warranty. And yes, that is true. But I would hate to be in a competition somewhere or have to rely on it to take a very important shot, one that might save your life or bag you a nice buck, and then have it break and have me miss the shot or drop out of the competition or DQ, and then just say, oh, well, at least my warranty is good. So I'd really recommend these going to lower recoiling rifles either which way. Next up, going with another slightly more expensive optic. This time it's going to be the Bushnell Match Pro ED 5-30 by 56. These are routinely in the $600 to $700-ish range, or more or less twice the price of the DiscoveryOpt. However, you're getting locking turrets with the MPED, much better overall components. It does feel pretty solid in hand, and you're getting a little bit more magnification. And I think a little bit overall better package. The Bushnell Match Pro ED is one of those scopes that once you get behind it once, you wonder when you're going to get behind it again because you just want to continue using it. It's so nice. However, there is a little bit of chromatic aberration and purple fringing that comes up on the MPED at the highest magnifications, but you dial it down ever so slightly, it's like 27x, and it mostly goes away. However, even if you do have it dialed with up to 30x and you have the side parallax set properly, as opposed to what I have here focusing on this can, which wasn't really 100%, it can still produce a very good image. As much as I like the reticle on the DO, the reticle on the MPED is vastly superior. There's so much information crammed into this thing, but it's still so easy to pick up and read, almost at any magnification. The illumination on it is also very good as well. As far as the overall length from the MPED to the DiscoveryOpt, it's about an inch shorter at 15.4 inches. It's about 12 ounces lighter, which is pretty substantial. And as far as the field of view, guess what? Almost identical. At the minimum of 5x, they're both 24.5 feet. And on the top end, 41 for the MPED because it goes up to 30 and 48 for the DO. As far as eye relief, the MPED actually has a little bit more at 3.8 inches. And we have a little bit larger view looking through it. The MPED is really one of those scopes that, like I've mentioned earlier in this video, it seems like Bushnell really thought out from the get-go. Not like, oh, let's just take all these parts that we have from random scopes and throw them together and see what it looks like. They were like, no. We're going to design this as a clean slate, and all the touch points are going to be a certain way. All the controls are going to function a certain way. And it absolutely shows. The MPED is a wonderful optic. And despite the fact it is twice the price of the DiscoveryOpt, I think you're getting almost twice the scope. It's a really enjoyable experience and something that I am contemplating getting to and selling a couple of other higher end price scopes just to have that on my shelf. Last but not least, no, it's not the MPED. I messed up, as I sometimes often do. At least I admit it. This is actually the Meopta Optica 6 5-30 by 56. Yeah. What can I say? I messed up on the titling. My bad. This scope comes in a little bit over twice the price of the DO at around $1,000. The only issue I have with this scope being the Meopta, is it's got a wonderful locking elevation turret, and a non-locking exposed windage turret. I really just want to take the designers or the people that checked the overall like design process at Meopta and just shake them violently and be like, what is wrong with you? You took a scope that could have been perfect and you just stupefied it. Just put a capped windage on it. Anything other than what you did. Anyway, rant over. The Optica 6s have been nothing but fantastic to me, and this 5 to 30 is no exception. We have a smaller view looking through it, but I feel much higher resolution to the glass. Overall length is, again, about an inch shorter than the Discovery Optic. Oddly enough, all of the scopes that I compared against this DO are an inch shorter. It's about 8 ounces lighter, and the Optica is not a very light scope to begin with at 36 ounces, 36 and change, but the Discovery Optic really is quite heavy. As far as our field of view, they're exactly the same at the minimum, but again, because this goes up to 30, it has 3.7 feet at 100 yards at 30x. But the one thing that the Optica doesn't have is the same size exit pupil, 9.5 to 1.9 millimeters, whereas again the DO is 11.2 to 2.2. Eye relief, the Meopta is also a half inch farther forward from the Discovery Optic at 3.9 inches. Again, though, numbers aren't everything, and despite the fact that the Optica 6 does have a slightly smaller exit pupil, it doesn't seem like it is impossible to get behind. It's definitely on the tighter side, but get a good cheek weld and you are going to be given a near perfect optical performance out of that scope. It really is something to appreciate, especially for the price point that they come in at. But it's like it got hit with the stupid stick a couple of times. It's like you took a scope, Meopta, that had so much potential and just ruined it for one little mistake. But that's the moral of the story, ladies and gentlemen. One little hiccup can take a scope from being perfect and change it into just a what if. What if they had done this instead of that? Could they have made it better? Could it have been worse and we just don't know what we're talking about? No, I don't think that's the case. Especially something as simple as with the Optica, where it just needs a locking windage. And it would have been amazing for the price, amazing value for the money. As far as this Discovery Optic Gen 2, however, there's not a lot I could really say negatively about it. Sure, it's got its quirks. As you saw, the reticle doesn't line up to my tracking test. However, at least the turrets are matched to what the reticle is showing. However, if you are really using the reticle and you know how to use the reticle properly, will you notice a roughly 3% deviation from perfect scaling? It's quite possible, but probably unlikely. What other real negative is there? The image isn't really that great in low light, especially above 16x. But other than that, just look at this thing. The image that this thing is capable of producing is great. The view through it is large. The scope profile is very small and slim. All the controls are actually really nice, or at least the ones that you're going to be using quite frequently. I would love to see the throw lever have a much larger thread diameter little stud coming off of it, because it would really fill me with a lot more assurance knowing that it's not going to just snap off in my hands. But other than that, this is a vastly improved scope over the Gen 1. So much so that even for its $350-ish price point, I really do feel like it can stack up against some of the other scopes that I compared this to at a much lower price point. Do I think that everyone should go out and buy this, though? No. You have to be in the market for something this inexpensive with this sort of feature set. But if you are looking for this exact style scope, or this scope in particular, just know that it is a vast improvement over the Gen 1, and something that I think I'm going to throw on one of my 22s and just leave it on there for maybe ever. It really is solid. especially for something that you don't have to worry so much about recoil or really hard use, because I can't vouch for the longevity of it, but at least all the controls feel pretty solid, and taking off the elevation turret showed that the erector did look pretty robust, as did the zero stop. So hopefully the internals don't completely fall apart on you and then just leave you with a dead scope. But if it did, Discovery Optics at least claims that their warranty is top notch. I haven't had to use it. Hopefully I never do, and hopefully you never do either. But with all that being said, this is, again, a vast improvement over the Gen 1, and I'm really impressed by how fast they got the Gen 2 out to market. Literally, it was like a year, maybe a little bit less. I did the review on the Gen 1. I showed them the review. I told them what I thought, and I was 100% blunt with them, and they said, okay, thank you. And they made some course corrections, and this is the result. And it is, frankly, impressive. Impressive. With all that being said, a huge thank you to Discovery Optics for sending this scope in for review and testing. They did tell me to keep it. I am going to keep it. I might actually send this out to some of my paid subscribers that are looking for a low-budget HPVO. I've done that with several scopes. In fact, my SLX Nova, I shipped out a long time ago, and it's just circulating around because everyone that gets their hands on that scope just loves that scope. And I'll probably never see that scope again, but you know what? It's fine because easy come, easy go. And if I can keep my viewers happy, then I will be happy. I don't really care about keeping the OEMs happy because ultimately, I'm not trying to make them happy. I'm trying to help guide them to make stuff that makes us happy. Because just like you, I'm a consumer. I want to have good products. I want to have products that I can get in hand and go, yes, I really like this, and I want other people to buy this because I think it's a good product. Not because someone said, hey, here's some money, or hey, here's a free scope. Go put a couple of nice words out for us, will you? No company's ever asked me to do that, and even if they did, I would tell them very politely, no thank you. So, lastly, one last time, thank you very much, Dio, for sending this in. But most importantly, thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen, for watching. It's because of you that I still do this. So, thank you, and I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.